Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Laugesen, Executive Secretary of the Committee on the Present Danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for more information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. Please sign up at presentdangerchina.substack.com for notifications of these webinars. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is the Executive Chairman of the Center for Security Policy and Vice Chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of our weekly webinar series sponsored by the Committee on the Present Danger China. We are, as ever, intent on exposing to the largest possible audience the true magnitude of the danger we face from the CCP, as well as the myriad ways in which that danger is being intensified to the point now where what we've mostly focused on in these conversations, namely the pre-kinetic, unrestricted warfare that the Chinese communists have engaged in for decades against America, may now be at any moment joined by the old-fashioned kind of warfare, the shooting kind, including inside America. That prospect makes all the more urgent the conversation we're going to have today, namely about what the Chinese Communist Party has been doing to, as they call it, capture our elite, to induce individuals, in some cases organizations, even institutions, to align themselves with the CCP, its priorities, its doctrine, its ambitions, in such a way as to advance all of those at the expense of our country, its safety, its citizens' lives and freedoms, and perhaps the very existence of our nation altogether. What we're going to be talking about today is the evidence of elite capture to date, the institution that is principally responsible for it, though it will be pointed out by some of our presenters that what's really going on here is a whole of society effort mounted by the Chinese Communist Party, but particularly the responsibility of its United Front Work Department, as it's called, to suborn and otherwise secure the services of leading figures in virtually every sector of American society, including our political leadership, and to both understand what that would mean, especially if, God forbid, we find ourselves in a circumstance of a shooting war, but even if it's just the further ratcheting up of the ongoing, unrestricted warfare, the pre-kinetic kind, the danger that it further represents to this country if we do not recognize, expose, and otherwise remove from positions of power and influence the captured elite working for the Chinese Communist Party inside America. I will shamelessly plug a book that my friend, colleague Dee Dee Laugesen and I authored entitled The Indictment, Prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party and Friends, and friends is the operative word there, for crimes against America, China, and the world. This is a product of the first roughly 70 of these webinars. We're up to 180 plus at this point, so there's a lot more texture to the points that were made in the book, but I do commend it to you as a short course on the nature of elite capture and what it means for our country at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party its United Front Work Department, and other entities of its intelligence services and party apparatus. We're going to begin our conversation today, as we often do in these programs, with a man with extraordinary and deep personal expertise in the business of intelligence and influencing others to help, in his case, our country. His name is Charles Sam Faddis. He worked for some 20 years as an undercover operative of the Central Intelligence Agency and has also served in a variety of other capacities, notably as an Army officer and a Deputy Attorney General out in Washington State. His insights into what we're dealing with here, and in particular, the tradecraft of the United Front Work Department, nicely sets the scene for the conversations that will follow. We have Sam, as is often the case, via video, and we will go to the video tape of his remarks now.
I think the first thing that people need to grasp, and it's difficult for the average normal layperson who doesn't spend all day in the arcane world of espionage, the first thing to grasp is the scale of what we're talking about. As I've said many times, every once in a while a case will blip and we'll start talking about Eric Swalwell or somebody else. And I think without anybody saying this explicitly, the implication is, well, so we found out about that case. We found out about the case. You're like, okay, you found out about a case, guys. And how many more do you think there are? Because not 5 more or 10 more, it's thousands more. The United Front, in essence, what you're talking about is a whole of government approach. So every element of the Chinese government, particularly those operating abroad, is involved in an effort to they're involved in what they call elite capture. Let's just use that phrase. So basically, they're grabbing a hold of anybody of influence in a society, and one way or the other, they are co-opting them to do China's bidding, to further its interests. Now, some of those folks are going to be dragged, what we would say in the trade, all the way down the rabbit hole to the point of being fully controlled paid assets who literally take direction from Chinese intelligence. And again, that's not a handful of guys, that's a lot of guys on a scale that most people don't even want to think about, but need to think about. But then, in addition to that, are the folks who are compromised in some essence, in some way. But the bottom line is they are furthering the interests of Communist China. And of course, in pursuit of this, we not only have the formal agencies that you would think about, the MSS, which is Chinese CIA, but then you have this whole raft of various friendship associations and cooperation associations, all the usual communist nonsense, but that all exist. Supposedly the idea is to further friendly, positive relations as if they're somehow thinking of us as well. Well, of course, that's absurd. That's not what they are at all. They are about gaining control over and influencing folks and getting them to do Beijing's bidding. And so this just happens on this absolutely massive scale. And what you then have is whole huge numbers of individuals who are influenced and are working for Communist China. And other elements, if you will, of tradecraft here. People will make a big deal out of a particular statement by Tim Walz. At one point, he said something that wasn't particularly laudatory about Beijing. Okay. Well, that's a Chinese doctrine that, you deliberately say some things that sort of are critical of China because essentially it's maintaining your cover. It's really not unique to Communist China. If I've got, in a parliamentary democracy, the Minister of the Interior is on our payroll I don't tell him to say nothing but pro-American things all day, every day, because even an idiot will figure out in a little while that this guy must be bought and paid for by the Americans. So he must selectively do things. And the more you're talking about a guy climbing the ladder, the more you're having to be very strategic about those things. Okay, we get it. You're going to have to take this position that appears to be contrary to, because it will help us in the long run. Anyway, this is a massive ongoing effort. As an example, just to bring this abstract discussion down to something concrete, CEFC China Energy, which is the company in quotes, that the Bidens were dealing with. I mean, they were dealing with other Chinese companies, but at the heart of everything they were doing with the Chinese and Chinese intelligence is CEFC China Energy. What gets referred to in the press all the time as an energy company, I think is what they say. Well, it's not an energy company. It entered into agreements and invested money in nonsensical agreement that it didn't turn a profit. Nothing they did was based on commercial considerations, I guess is what I'm trying to say. What they did was based on gaining control over important people in critical countries. And that's the whole reason they invested money. They were not investing money with Hunter Biden because they thought Hunter was going to make him a lot of money in a commercial sense. They were investing with Hunter because they were buying the Biden family. And they did it all around the world. I mean, they were shut down a few years ago. But guys, folks, that doesn't mean anything, because when they shut down CEFC China Energy, it was replaced with another entity all that is shutting down a cover mechanism in intelligence terms. That front company was blown. So we shut it down and we replaced it with something else. They didn't go anywhere. So, I mean, that's the essence of what's going on with the United Front, is buying influence.
Buying influence, indeed. And we're going to talk about how long this practice has gone on under the Chinese communists. I think it could be argued it is a well-established practice of successive emperors of China long before the communists came to power. But to get an insight into what this practice of elite capture or United Front work has been going back to the very beginnings of the Chinese Communist Party, I'm delighted to have with us by video once again, a video, in fact, from an interview that we did with our guest in the course of a recent production of Securing America, program I do on Real America's Voice and the American Family Radio, and here in Washington on WRC, the Salem radio outlet. Her name is Xi Van Fleet. She's the author of a very important new book. It's entitled Mao's America, A Survivor's Warning. It draws upon her personal life experience growing up in communist China through the Cultural Revolution, the apex, arguably, of Mao Zedong's tyranny. And she has, of course, come to considerable renown in this country as a result of her warnings that the Cultural Revolution is underway here as well, notably in the schools of Northern Virginia and elsewhere. And we are very proud to have her with us to shed light on the long march, if you will, of the United Front from its inception in China to its impact here. I wanted to see if we might ask you to talk a little bit about something that's kind of in the news, finally, and that is the influence operations that the Chinese Communist Party mounts in this country and the success that it has had in, I think to use their term, capturing Americans' elite. How does this work, and how important a priority to the Chinese Communist Party is it?
Yeah, this is something that's as old as Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party. It's called United Front. And so they use this tactic to unite with the nationalists in the very beginning in the 1920s and infiltrated the party and basically about to take over the party until there was a big split. And then the Kuomintang, or the nationalists, cleaned out the Chinese Communist Party members. And then they started again during the Japanese War. And the same result. So that United Front practiced twice in China always ended up with the Chinese Communist Party infiltrated the Nationalist Party and really divided from within and caused the defeat of the nationalists. So that is really what it does. It's identify people that they need, that has influence, and try to buy them, try to influence them. And so now the war is global. And of course, the main target is America. So what it does is identify people they want to influence, they want to use to further influence others. And then they use all sorts of tactics. Money is, one of them. And prestige. They promote authors. Yeah, they promote authors like Hillary's book sold millions of copies in China. And it was like a required reading for the party members. So I don't know how millions of dollars Hillary made from her book by selling it in China by the CCP. So they influence people with money, with prestige. If you don't need money, you don't need, well, how about maybe one day you need organ transplant, right? They have everything. They have everything anyone will need one way or the other.
Let me talk to you about one other aspect of this. People who don't need an organ transplant or aren't necessarily motivated by money, but who have an ideological affinity.
Yes.
How is that applied by this United Front effort?
Well, that's just easier. That they don't even have to work that hard, such as Tim Walz. He loves everything. He went to China and find that is the kind of system he wants for America. And for him, I don't think the CCP has to work that hard. So he formed a team, a tour company to take American young people. So Chinese Communist Party want to influence the next generation, pro-CCP, next generation of Americans. So
you're saying that in this case, this effort to give American kids language skills in Mandarin, for example, or simply experiencing communist China would actually turn into a vehicle for this kind of influence operation? Do you think?
Absolutely. They spend, in the beginning, they spend a lot of money in academia, such as universities, college universities using Confucian Institutes, right? Yeah, many of them have been taken down, but they just change form, change their name. But in recent years, they have been spending a lot of money on high schools. And in Fairfax, I think the Thomas Jefferson High School, they put a lot of money there, and also in other high schools in Iowa. In a high school that Xi Jinping invited a group of kids, everything covered, all the expense covered, to go to China and visit. For what? For influence. He spent so much money in American public schools, while in rural area in China, the peasants' kids had hardly a roof over their classrooms. He is buying influence.
By some estimates, they're spending about $16 billion a year, the Chinese Communist Party, in the United States alone. This is a prodigious amount of money, given how little it takes to buy an awful lot of people.
That is the key. Right? A little free trip might just do the job and create a new future pro-CCP American. That's how they started, from very low as kids in high school, as high as the presidency. They have people bought everywhere, corporations, media. It is really sad, even in our military.
Gee, let me just ask you, you mentioned Tim Walz. There are concerns that Kamala Harris also has, the most San Francisco Democrats, by the way, have long-standing ties to United Front Work Department front groups, in some cases operating out of the Chinese consulate in San Francisco or elsewhere in the Chinese American community. What's your best assessment of her ideological affinity for the CCP?
She's a communist. Simple. Because she believes in equity. She believes in government control the economy. You know, she's a communist, absolutely. The thing is that it's not just the individuals. The Democratic Party has been captured. It has become transformed into a communist party. The elite, I'm not talking about every member, but every member, just what they do. They have to line up, they just have to obey. And that's what we see in today's Democratic Party.
Yeah. I guess you don't have to look much further than the coup that they mounted against Joe Biden in the name of democracy, defending democracy.
And it's just stunning that people just cheered. Yeah, they say that Joe Biden saved democracy. This is the long time dumbing down of American. That's what you see. Those people, they no longer think for themselves. They just obey and follow the party. That's what I was told when I was growing up in China. Follow the party and obey the party. The party can never be wrong. And that's what we see here in America today.
G. Van Fleet, thank you for this bracing assessment, this contribution. Let me emphasize that we're not partisan here. We're trying to lay out the facts as best we understand them and allow Americans to make their own decisions about the import of those facts and, in particular, what they will choose to do with them in terms of making, hopefully, informed decisions this fall. The views of our guests that you've just heard are their own, of course, but we appreciate their contributions to this effort to illuminate the facts. We're going to hear next from a man who does as powerful a job as anybody I know in that department. He is a professional dot connector, as I see it. He has done exhaustive research on the phenomenon of elite capture. By the way, not just by the Chinese Communist Party, but by others hostile to this country and, I would argue Judeo-Christian civilization more generally, including a whole cohort of other people who are really outside of the remit, as they say, in diplomatic circles of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, but are very much top of mind for all of us who are worried about the security of the country. Those would be what I call Sharia supremacists, who are also now being inserted into this country in large numbers, as they have been in Europe and elsewhere. We will be focusing on the Chinese cohort, but I do think that what Trevor Loudon has done over his extraordinary career in terms of documenting and exposing those who are connected with elements of the so-called red-green axis, the communists on the left, the Islamists, the green on the right, not on the right necessarily, but of the green, that's for sure, has been unsurpassed, really. And we've benefited from it enormously in our work together with him as a member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. I encourage you to check out his various books on the subject about enemies within the church, books and movies, I should say, as well, of those names, as well as 2 multi-volume sets of books that he is in the process of publishing. One, Security Risk Senators, the other, House Un-Americans. We're always delighted to have him with us, especially live, and we have the benefit of his participating live so we can not only hear from him now, but also take some questions and answer time with him too. Trevor Loudon, it's wonderful to have you back, sir. Welcome. Once again, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much, Frank. My next book is Stealth, Kamala Harris's Communist Roots, so it'll be added to the collection. But I want to talk today, very briefly, I want to quote a speech done in 2016 by a gentleman called Jin Kun Rong. Now, he is Deputy Director of the Center for American Studies at Renmin University and a top advisor to Xi Jinping and is also an advisor to the Central United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party. And he gave this speech in 2016. This was when Trump was battling Hillary Clinton. But I think it shows the long-term strategic planning of the Chinese when it comes to influence. So he starts out with some quotes. He said there were 4 stages of Chinese communist development. Mao Zedong solved the problem of survival for China. Mao consolidated the revolution, made sure the Communist Party didn't collapse. Deng Xiaoping solved the problem of development. He opened the economy. He developed the economy. Xi Jinping, he is solving the problem of respect, getting China respected on the world stage as an equal partner or superior to the United States. The task of the next generation, he says, is to put the United States under our jurisdiction and management. So this is the next stage for the development of the Chinese Communist Party, to put the United States under their jurisdiction. Now let's talk about the US-China relations. What is the place of US-China relations in the whole of Chinese diplomacy today? It is the biggest challenge. The US is very powerful. It is the #1 right now, very capable. Frankly speaking, now the United States is still a middle-aged, strong man. It has not reached retirement age yet. It is like someone in a workplace who is very good looking, very capable, and basically very popular among co-workers. We are like the #2 boss who just got promoted. We want to squeeze the US out, but we do not dare to fight it. It is quite difficult. So we in China are trying to come up with various ways. Let's first create conditions for them to make mistakes. So we've got to get them making mistakes in foreign policy, internal policy. Second, we keep the US so busy that it will suffer from depression and want to quit the job itself. Third, we should get ourselves mixed together with the US so it cannot fight us. We should create such a situation where you have me inside you and I have you inside me. So this is a deliberate strategy to so integrate their supply chains, business, politics, that we can't fight them because they're us. We can't fight them because they give us our steel, they give us our drugs and medicine. Now here's something on technology. In the past 30 years, Germany has given us the biggest help with their technology importation. But the Yankees have the best technology in the world. The world's most cutting edge technologies in the last 30 years were all invented by the Americans. But they just do not sell them to us. If you don't sell to us, we won't be polite. In the past, there was no internet, so we had nothing to do. Now, since there is such a thing as the internet, we will, of course, make good use of it. Then it goes on about stealing. Basically, if they won't sell it, we're going to steal it, and we won't be polite about it. Very, very clear about that. China's long-term strategy has probably the following key points. I don't know the long-term strategy of the United States. If Hillary Clinton comes to power, she will continue the current policy. If Trump comes to power, I do not know what the long-term strategy will be. Our long-term strategy has been very consistent. The first priority is to develop ourselves. This cannot be shaken. After we develop to a certain extent, the United States will have to accept us. Yesterday, the United States of America is in essence a nation that does things around business. Business people are not that stubborn or too emotional, so they will accept it if their opponent is strong to a certain extent. Now the United States is stronger than us, so they despise us. But in the future, when we are particularly strong, he will say, "Tu hao, let's make friends. We are now going in this direction." And here's where he talks about how the tactics with America, the geopolitical. For example, we built some islands in the South China Sea in the Spratlys, which greatly irritated the United States. But we waited until the United States got itself into fights with Syria. We waited till it got itself involved in Ukraine. We only built the islands then. When the US found out that we had built such large islands by the end of last June, we immediately said to it, "Oh, my dear boss, we will stop it." But we reported to the United States, we said, "Hey, boss, we are not building it anymore." The United States was very happy for a few months. They thought, after all, we are still the boss. You see, China controls things well. So they deliberately play us. And here's another one. There is also another strategy called getting deeper into the United States. Now we are talking to the United States about something called bilateral investment treaty, which may have a partial result before Obama leaves office. The goal is so that our domestic capital has somewhere to go. We can have a way out in the US. In the meantime, we make money and control the market. We in the Chinese government hope that in the end, every US congressman's district will have Chinese investment, and China will be able to control 1,000 or several thousand votes, and then we can influence the congressman's attitude. In fact, the United States House of Representatives can be controlled because the United States has 312 million people and 435 members of the House of Representatives. On average, a congressional district has about 750,000 people. Voter turnout is only 30%. That is about 200,000 votes can decide his fate, the congressman's fate. Generally speaking, the numbers of votes for the two candidates are very close. The gap won't be particularly large. So in the end, there's only a difference of 10,000 or several thousand votes. Therefore, if you can have several thousand votes at your hands, you are as good as his master. In other words, you can control that Congress member. If China conducts good operations in the United States, we may be able to buy it over and turn the US into our second standing committee of the National People's Congress. And that's basically a subsidiary of the Chinese government. And here's another one. Of course, we can also have other evil tricks. This is his word, evil tricks, such as throwing the world into further chaos. The United States has a problem. It is really very diverse. Of course, diversity has an advantage. The people have the freedom, have a say, but it also has a disadvantage. It is very difficult to build national consensus for the United. So therefore, this is Black Lives Matter. This is exploiting our diversity to throw America into chaos. Black Lives Matter is a Chinese operation. The Chicano organizations are Chinese. And then they talk about on an international scale. If there are two enemies, the United States is dumbfounded at a loss as what to do. This was the case before World War II. There were two enemies for the US. One was the black threat of Nazi Germany. One was the red threat of the Soviet Union. If there are three external enemies outside the United States, I reckon it will start to feel dizzy. If it has four enemies, it will completely get lost. So China's strategic task is to ensure that there are four enemies for the United States. Terrorists are certainly one. Russia is very much like one, but not enough. And they go on about using Brazil, using other countries. But the point I'm getting at here is this has been a planned strategy since 1949. This is the Chinese Communist Party's never given up. The stage under Deng Xiaoping was just classic Marxism, use capitalism to build your economy, to go forward to the next stage. And the fourth stage is the the ownership and control of the country. Now, I'll briefly talk about Kamala Harris, Tim Waltz. Kamala Harris comes out of a Maoist machine. Her parents were Maoists. She went to a Marxist social club as a grade schooler. Her parents were in an organization that set up the Black Panthers, which was a Maoist organization. Her boyfriend, Willie Brown, was a communist who became Communist China's best friend in the Bay Area. But her key mentor was a former student Maoist, one of the richest men in California, who set up the Democracy Alliance, a network of left-wing billionaires, set up the Center for American Progress, ProPublica, but also gave us Barack Obama, gave us Stacey Abrams, gave us Cory Booker, almost gave us Andrew Gillum, who tried for the governor of Florida, and gave us Kamala Harris. This Maoist businessman funded Kamala's, getting the DA's job in San Francisco, funded her to get the Attorney General's job in California, got her into the US Senate, and got her on the Democratic ticket. One last thought. This all goes back to the Rainbow Coalition of the 1980s. Jesse Jackson had a philosophy which he got from the Black Panthers of uniting all the minorities with the white progressives to achieve electoral majorities. And he did very well, but in the 1980s, minorities were 19% of the population. Now they're 40%. The Rainbow Coalition was run by Maoist communists from the League of Revolutionary Struggle, Communist Workers' Party, etc. Steve Phillips was part of this. He updated the Rainbow Coalition strategy to get his very good friend Barack Obama elected twice. Obama was elected on the Jesse Jackson strategy of uniting the white progressives and the progressives of color. This is the Kamala Harris ticket. They call it the New American Majority. This is what is being done. This is a Maoist strategy, running a Maoist candidate, a candidate of color, a perfect rainbow candidate, woman, Asian, black, appeal to all these different demographics, and that's how they intend to win. It's not a matter of the quality of the candidate, it's do they tick certain boxes. That's all it is. And so what we're seeing is a pro-Chinese ticket standing for one of the mainstream parties, backed by a Chinese-backed machine and voting registration machine that's been active here since the 1980s, but went into overdrive in the last few years. So this is part of the elite capture. The ultimate elite capture is to put the president and the vice president in the White House. Can you think of a better coup for the United Work Front Department than that? Because that is exactly what is happening here.
Trevor, thank you. An extraordinarily powerful distillation, again, of pertinent facts, and we appreciate your joining us to speak about them and to take some questions in a moment. We're going to hear next, again via video, again from our television program, a really wonderful hour-long conversation that I had recently with Peter Schweitzer, a man I think probably best known at this point for his series of best-selling books, often about corruption in high office. In the case of his most recent one, Blood Money, about why American elites are turning a blind eye to the Chinese Communist Party threat. He is doing so in a way that is informed by a deep understanding of our national security, as well as the various forces at work trying to undermine it or actually destroy it outright, as is true of the Chinese Communist Party. We asked Peter to explore this phenomenon of blood money and the impetus behind it, in the words of the Chinese communists, elite capture, by giving us some, in this particular version, 2 case studies of the betrayal of America to the Chinese Communist Party's benefit. Let's go to the videotape with Peter Schweitzer now.
The premise behind U.S. policy towards China going back 30 years, and that is we engage them, we form these commercial financial bonds, and it will wed the Chinese to the international financial system and make them less hostile. That has not worked. What has happened, however, is that financial ties between China and certain elites have sort of chained them or tied them to the status quo policy towards China. You know, at the time in the 1990s, Frank, we remember it. Everybody was saying, oh, we just need to build up China economically. They'll become more like us. That certainly didn't happen. And the problem with that is not only did this approach strengthen China, it created these attachments and these connections between American elites who now risk losing a lot of money if they advocate for a tougher position on China. But you could argue that in the 1990s because you didn't have a huge track record. You can't argue that now. And yet you look at the big Wall Street outfits, the, Bridgewater Associates, Ray Dalio, for example. These are not dumb people. You might disagree with them on certain things. They're smart people. They know what they're doing. And for them to continue to insist that this is the approach to go forward, in fact, to even insist, as Ray Dalio has, that the Chinese government is somehow more responsive to the needs of the Chinese people than the representative government of the United States is absurd. And they know it's absurd. And so there's no logical explanation unless we're going to contend that all these people have lost their minds. We know the answer is, and the answer is in the case of Ray Dalio, that, he was the first hedge fund allowed to invest in China, to allow Chinese individuals to invest in it. First one to do it, made that company even more rich. So they have very powerful incentives. And I think what we have to understand in the United States is confronting the Chinese threat. There are a lot of people on the Republican side, rightfully so, who look at the Chinese military buildup, the need for us to invest in military hardware and military personnel. But none of that is going to do any good if the political leadership class refuses to see China as a threat or is prepared to explain it away. And there's a lot of evidence of that on so many fronts. The Russians were crude and unsophisticated on this. They were sort of a blunt force instrument. China is very much a stiletto. There's been nothing this sophisticated, this widespread, and backed by as much money as we're talking about. So these are completely new waters for the United States, and I think a lot of our leaders are hopelessly naive about what China's doing. In the case of Mitch McConnell, they had this small shipping business that the Chinese helped make a very large, successful shipping business. In the case of the Bidens, there really isn't even an underlying business. When Joe Biden became vice president of the United States in 2009, a couple of months later, Hunter Biden decided he was going to go into international finance, even though he had no background in it. And one of the big places he targeted was China. And if you look at the work that's been done by the House Oversight Committee, we've done some work with them. We've done our own independent research, of course. You find that over the course of Joe Biden's tenure as vice president of the United States, the Biden family received some $31 million from 5 Chinese businessmen. There's no evidence of any discernible legitimate service or product that was given in return for this money. No expertise, no capital, no patents, nothing. So that's the first thing that should be concerning, because these Biden individuals are not just sending money to the Bidens and expecting nothing in return. Then when you look at these 5 individuals, you find that all of them have ties to the highest levels of Chinese intelligence. Now, I know that China is a super intelligent state. It's a police state. But when I say the highest levels, I'm talking about one guy that sent $5 million to the Bidens was business partners with the daughter of the Minister of State Security, who runs the entire Chinese spy apparatus. This guy sent $5 million to the Bidens. So the question is, what do the Chinese expect in return? And I think it is good help with a little bad mouth. And I think that's what they've been given by Joe Biden. The Joe Biden of the 1990s and early 2000s was much harder on China than he became when he became vice president and the money started to flow. And what you saw with him as vice president and now as president of the United States is someone who will occasionally ding them for the treatment of the Uyghurs, But when it comes to the big issue, China's involvement in the fentanyl trade, for example, really nothing is being said and being done on those fronts, which is precisely what China is looking for from Joe Biden. We've been researching Kamala Harris and now Tim Walz for a while. Neither of them are quite like the Bidens. The Bidens, it seems pretty transactional with the CCP. I think what you're talking about with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz is, let's say, more of a fellow traveler kind of mentality, certain sympathies to the manner in which the Chinese govern. In the case of Kamala Harris, you look at both of her parents, her father, who's Jamaican, economics professor, openly a Marxist, mother, a medical researcher, highly regarded medical researcher, but also has a very, very left-wing Marxist Maoist ideas. That's certainly the genesis of it. In the case of Tim Walz, where we've done a lot of research, you find the same thing. You know, he had this student exchange program that he was running. One of the students that attended in a newspaper at the time described how Tim Walz told them that they needed to minimize their Americanness when they traveled to China, which is really an odd thing to say if you're engaged in cultural exchange. I mean, you certainly wouldn't tell Chinese students coming to the United States to minimize their Chineseness. And then you look at the fact that these programs were funded by the CCP, that it fits the profile, certainly in the statements that he's made, that it fits the profile of somebody who is sympathetic to the CCP. He is not critical of them, and it is big help with a little bad mouth again. Tim Walz has kind of dinged them on human rights, but even there on the floor of Congress, when he talked about Tiananmen Square, where the most authoritative accounts say 10,000 people were killed by the People's Liberation Army, on the floor of the House, he compares that to Wounded Knee in the United States, which happened in the 19th century. You know, again, terrible event, but it's a ridiculous comparison, especially since Wounded Knee, of course, instantly became a scandal in the United States. But then you look at the CCP, after that massacre took place, President Xi's wife, who's a famous singer in China, actually serenaded the troops who participated in the massacre. So this kind of moral equivalence is just ridiculous. Tim Walz knows better, and I think it's part of this sort of soft sympathy that he has for the CCP, and you see that in other positions as well. As governor of Minnesota, of course, he's not engaged in foreign policy per se, but just look at two striking things that we know happened in Minnesota under his tenure. One is that the Twin Cities in Minnesota are one of the 7 cities in the United States that has these Chinese secret police stations. You've talked about them. These are, run by these United Front organizations. They are designed to intimidate ethnic Chinese, others living in the United States that might be critical of the CCP. They have abducted people. They have threatened people. Once in the Twin Cities, it is affiliated with an organization called Minnesota Global, which is a pro-Waltz organization that is promoting sort of, global connections with Minnesota. Now, Tim Waltz was very outspoken as governor of Minnesota about police brutality, as he called it, involving the Twin Cities police. He never talks about this. He hasn't done anything about this secret police station. You have to wonder why. Some of the state pension funds in the United States have been scaling back their investments in China. One state that has increased their investments in China state pension funds is Minnesota's. And the chairman of that body is Governor Waltz. So he's going in the opposite direction of everybody else and pouring U.S. taxpayer money to investing in China when the rest of the world is running the other way.
Peter, that was superb. Thank you. As always, your clarity on what is going on to some extent behind the scenes is incredibly important to amplifying what we are seeing and helping us make sense of it. So thank you for making yourself available through our previous interview. We're going to complete our presentations for today with one of our favorite cleanup batters. His name is Colonel Grant Newsom, United States Marine Corps retired. He has the distinction of not only having served with distinction in uniform much of his career in Asia, but also having served as a Foreign Service officer in our embassy in Japan, as well as in the years since he left government service working as a businessman, much of it forward deployed in the Western Pacific. Grant Newsom is the author most recently of a very timely book, clearly, especially for this present purpose. It is called When China Attacks, a Warning to America. We have an opportunity to both evaluate with his help the United Front contribution to when China attacks, but also just from the point of view of an experienced and accomplished military officer, especially, what are the strategic and, yes, military implications of having the Chinese Communist Party and its friends operating inside our wire? Colonel, it's so good to have you with us. Thank you. I know it's a late hour where you are. We appreciate your being willing to contribute to these programs always, but especially when it entails that bit of hardship. So thank you, sir. Welcome, and walk us through your assessment of this, if you would.
Sure. Glad to be here, Frank. So I'll look at this from a military perspective. To put it in the simplest terms, if you have the enemy sort of in your rear, you're going to lose, or your odds of success have decreased by about 90%. So in the last couple years, a few years, there's at least a sense that China is a military threat. And there's some talk of rebuilding the U.S. military, and there's even some steps in that direction. But you could get everything right militarily and still lose. And that's an important thing to remember. And a little bit of background and history is also important to understand how we got here. We've wasted the last 20 years thinking that China really wasn't an enemy and just had to be treated like a friend, and then we'd have a friend. I'll cite a couple examples that are good ones. In early 2000s, around 2006 or so, the Commandant of the Marine Corps went to China to visit the Chinese Marines, and he gave them a pep talk saying, "Boys, master your profession." Well, they've done that. And then in about 2015, the deputy commander of the Marines in the Pacific went and visited the Chinese military as well. And this was considered a great coup by the staff that arranged this. And what you had going on here was these guys are sort of on the tail end, or the bottom of this elite capture, this almost mass hypnosis of American elites that took place to say that China wasn't an adversary, just had to be accommodated and engaged with. And these guys were just reflecting that thinking. And another good example for about that same time, the mid-2010s, when there's some very clear warnings given about Chinese missile capabilities, particularly hypersonics, that everybody's got their hair on fire about now. And these warnings were given to a very, very senior U.S. military officer. I won't say who he is. And I asked the guy who delivered the warning what was the response, and he said there was no interest. So we squandered a lot of time, and this is not obviously what you want to do. When you look at our military problem, we've let ourselves get into such a difficult spot that it's hard to get out of. And for many years, there was this conga line almost of senior officers, general officers, flag officers, who just were dying for a visit to the PRC. And that's how it was. So it's made it very hard for America to cobble together a defense against the PRC militarily because of all these years we spent acting like this. But now there's more to it, of course, if you look at it from a military perspective than just sort of guns and planes and ships. But you also have to look at the state of your own society, your own ruling class. And this is where you look at what Wall Street, the U.S. business community do that prevents us from taking the proper military steps to defend ourselves. And effectively, they're undercutting what you might do militarily. And the Wall Street, the business class, have been funding the buildup of the Chinese military for all these years. So it may not always be Chinese. It's not usually, in fact, Chinese people in our wire. But these are Americans, proxies, that have been this elite capture we've talked about, that have really carried China's water. And anytime someone tries to get not just tough on China, but just to take commonsensical measures to stand up and defend ourselves, you get this pressure from Wall Street, the financial class, the business community. And This is something even the Trump administration had to deal with. The first administration that got things right for China, they had to fight an internal civil war from what were effectively Chinese proxies. And it's not just business and finance, but you get academia, this intellectual class, supposedly. Remember that full-page ad that they had put in a paper in 2019 saying, or it was either that or I forget, an editorial, but it was prominently displayed in major newspapers and said China is not an enemy. It was signed by a large number of luminaries, and the thinking was, well, treat China like a friend and we'll have a friend, treat him like an enemy and you'll have an enemy. As Professor Joseph Nye, then Assistant Secretary of Defense, said in a while back during the Clinton era when he had an office or position. And then you have, say, with the most recent administration, you have Janet Yellen, Secretary of Treasury, going on talking about the need to maintain financial stability in China. Well, that's the last thing we should be doing. So you've got, on one hand, we say we're going to build up our military to defend against the PRC, and then the other, you're saying you have your administration and top officials saying, well, we want to stabilize them so that they have financial stability. Well, that isn't what you want to do to the country that calls you their main enemy. But the one thing that really says everything, and it's really a bipartisan achievement of just how effective the Chinese have been in terms of elite capture and the effect it has had on our defenses, is fentanyl. That, if you do the math and count up the dead since this really started in earnest around 2013, you're getting up towards 1 million Americans who've been killed by this. All of it comes from China. They could stop it if they wanted. And now and then there's some complaining about it. But you look at what has Capitol Hill done? What have our representatives done? And the short answer is nothing. And this is what the Chinese have done, is effectively taking off about 3 or 4 divisions of potential troops every year off the battlefield. Many of these people who are killed are people who might serve in the military. They're of that age. And this is just the dead. The wounded who can't function is even bigger. And that has a huge effect on U.S. military capabilities and protection. Just going back to the border, we know what's happened there. And the Chinese would have to be total morons not to have slipped in any number of fifth columnists, special forces who will act when the time comes. And not just Chinese. You've got Hezbollah, got Middle Eastern terrorists. There's a list of people that they could put in. And as I said, they'd have to be pretty stupid not to have done it. So you can see that the elite capture, these efforts to subvert, have actually been very successful in weakening our defenses. And the last thing I would cite is that, and it goes back to that speech from the Chinese fellow that Trevor read about using the internet. And this is really, we have lost one of our biggest advantages, and that's the distance, the space we had that protected us. And now the Chinese are in our rear, behind the wire. And in 1796, in his farewell address, George Washington referred to America's detached and distant situation. And that's what he was talking about. We had the advantage of geography that gave us some protection. We don't have it anymore. We'd be hard-pressed to think of something optimistic to say at 3 a.m. in the morning, but I just don't see what it is. We've really got our work cut out for us. Maybe we'll get one more chance. And the game's not over, but it's certainly late in the day. So thanks very much.
Colonel, thank you, and especially for rising to the occasion in the wee hours of the morning, your time. We're blessed to have 2 of our presenters with us to take a couple of questions. I thank you for sticking around to do that. Trevor, let me start with you. You have heard what others have said, as well as, of course, been able to make your own comments. As you look at this whole of society enterprise that is, for shorthand, going to be described here as the United Front, could you just drill down a little bit further on the role that the Chinese are playing inside our wire in terms of the election? You've alluded to at least registration, but I'm interested in other things like TikTok and perhaps illegal voting. It occurred to me, as the Colonel was just saying, we believe we do have Special Operations Forces of the People's Liberation Army here, perhaps multiple divisions worth. Will they be allowed to vote in our election if illegals are going to be part of that? Could you sort of talk us through how you see that?
Even if they don't vote, their body voting. As long as the numbers are there, people can vote in their stead. As long as they can fog a mirror, they can be voting. Look, Aliso Medina, who was Obama's informal immigration advisor, said explicitly, he said 11 million illegals, this was in 2010, they will vote 80% for a particular party. That will give us, if they are legalized and given the vote, that will give us an unchallengeable majority going forward. Well, it's a lot more than 10 million now, I'll tell you. But what I've contended is this. Like Virginia used to, I'll give you an example. Virginia used to be a really red state. It went blue because New Virginia Majority, a voter registration group set up by Liberation Road, the same pro-Chinese communist group that set up Black Lives Matter, did voter registration in Northern Virginia, signed up 300,000 minority voters, then prevailed on Terry McAuliffe, the governor of Virginia, to pardon 200,000 felons, and that 500,000 base is what they used. But they were using GIS computerized maps, so they could have every precinct in Virginia mapped out very scientifically. And those maps were made by a Liberation Road communist called Steve McClure, a graduate of the George Mason University Geography Department, who makes those maps and still does out of the Geography Department of Wuhan University, China. And this is easily documentable. But this network, see what the tactic is, they're using the Rainbow Coalition strategy in all the southern states. This network is the reason that North Carolina is now blue. This is the reason that Georgia has moved very purple. This is the reason Arizona has gone very purple. These networks are working the southern states, running candidates, extreme left candidates of color, and mobilizing the minority base. This is the Rainbow Coalition strategy playing out in the South. In 2019, the Chinese Progressive Association, the main agency for Communist China in San Francisco, the people who started Black Lives Matter, really, they set up an organization called Seed the Vote. Now, this is a network of a whole bunch of voter registration organizations in key swing states using Black Lives Matter operatives, all run by Maoists. Pennsylvania, they had Pennsylvania Stands Up. Michigan, they had Detroit Action. Wisconsin, they had black leaders organizing communities. Arizona, they had Lucha, which made 8 million phone calls and knocked on 1 million doors. Georgia, they had the New Georgia Project. I think most people will recognize these states as being the key states that influenced the last election. Well, this Seed the Vote network, which is directly linked to the Chinese consulate, boasts that they won the election in 2020 and again, and had a big impact in 2022. And now they're geared up to do it again in 2024. So we talk about election interference, but nobody's talking about the actual Chinese connected voter registration organizations strategically placed in key swing states around the country. You know, if you were Xi Jinping and you had a budget, you know, you could spend billions of dollars on a trade war to bring America down. You'd probably lose it. You could spend trillions of dollars on a shooting war prematurely and may risk losing it. Or you could spend a couple of $1 billion buying American politicians and sponsoring voter registration organizations in key states. What would you do? And the other thing, as I mentioned in the other Chinese guy, he mentioned getting business organizations in every state that could influence elections. We talk about not letting the Chinese buy land next to a military base. No, you don't let them set up battery plants in Michigan. You don't let them set up solar panel factories, because they set up in an area, they bring in the unions, which they control. That changes the whole voting demographic of the region. If they can set up an organization in a part of northern Michigan that employs 4,000 people, plus the unions that go with it, plus the business organizations that depend on it, they will soon control the politics of that district. And that is the plan right across the nation. The people who advocate complete decoupling from China, economically, politically, militarily, everything, are the only people who know what's going on here. This is the only way forward.
Grant, you spoke about financial piece of this effort to penetrate and subvert our country. We've done any number of programs on the elites that have been captured on Wall Street and the assistance that, as a result of their compromise, has been rendered, much of it unwittingly, by American investors, by some estimates, over 100 million of them, who through public pension funds or 401k plans or mutual funds or exchange-traded funds or other investment vehicles are having their money made available to support the Chinese Communist Party. I'd be interested in your insights into the particular effectiveness of this line of attack inside our wire, if you will, but also from a military perspective, how this is translating into effectively our direct subsidizing, I guess you might say, of the People's Liberation Army's military modernization program with, after all, weapons aimed at us.
Sure. The Chinese currency, the RMB, is not convertible, which means nobody really wants it outside of China. So China has to have convertible currency, which is basically US dollars. They have gotten that by US and Western and Japanese investment into China. That gives them dollars. But also anything they manufacture and we buy, we pay in dollars. So we're effectively providing them with the currency they need to do things like buy Australian iron ore to make steel to build their navy, to buy technology from the U.S. that they need for their military buildup. Dual-use technology, allegedly, but they've used it very effectively. Well, they have to pay in dollars. We provide the vast majority of that, and that's been going on for a few decades now. We and the Europeans have effectively been doing the equivalent of writing them a check every year for about $1 trillion. It's a little less now, and they use that money to build up their military, and without it, they wouldn't have anywhere near what they have.
Indeed, and what they're getting, even as we speak, as well. Trevor, there was a phrase that I think was introduced into this conversation by Peter, but I know that as you have monitored scores of members of the House of Representatives and some 30 members of the Senate and other legislators and public office holders, this expression, big help, little bad mouth, is something you've come across, or at least the phenomenon itself. Could you talk about the extent to which this sort of dichotomy between some rhetorical criticisms of the CCP, its human rights abuses, its slave labor, its organ harvesting, its, building of islands in the South China Sea, whatever it might be, unaccompanied by corrective action, and the degree to which this really is an essential element, as I think Peter's indicated, of the concealment, if you will, of the captured elite in our country.
As Peter said, this is nothing new to the Chinese. There was a memo discovered in the archives of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the early 90s about a visit by a man called Joe Biden, a US senator at the time, to the Soviet Union. And Joe Biden had made some comments on the Soviet Union's very poor human rights record. But when he got to the Soviet Union, he told the people there, please don't pay any attention to that. I have to do that for American consumption. I am still with you. So this is the thing. You have to cover yourself. You can't just come out and praise the Soviet Union or praise China all the time. We hear a lot of politicians who will go on and on about the Chinese human rights record, but they'll never do anything significant to counter China's military or political or economic ambitions in this country. Mitch McConnell was a classic example. He will actively sabotage candidates who may break out of that mold and may actually do something effective. And you see this all the time in the West, You've got a horrible human, we stand with the Tibetans, we stand with the Uyghurs or whatever, but we want to keep the money flowing. It gives a certain credibility when you say, look, I'm a big critic of Chinese human rights. I've always stood with the Uyghurs. I've always championed the cause of the Tibetans. But what have you actually done to actually stop the Chinese gaining influence in this country? Nothing. It's cover. It's only cover. Nancy Pelosi's a classic for this. She's a past master at doing this.
As you've documented intensively, Trevor, essentially the San Francisco Democrats, or much of California, I guess at this point, really are in the clutches of the Chinese Communist Party now, no?
Well, the Soviets got in there through the International Labor Workers, International Longshore Workers Union in Stanford University in the 30s, and the Chinese took it over. The Chinese run the Bay Area. All of those Bay Area politicians kowtowed to China to some degree. From Dianne Feinstein to Nancy Pelosi to Barbara Lee, and Kamala Harris is right from that. She is the honest young people become communists when they go to college. Kamala became a communist in the cradle. She has never been anything else.
And just to follow up on that, when you look at this issue of influence within our election system, and you've done some wonderful analysis, particularly, I think, on the registration side, but it is hard to overstate the impact that even relatively small investments by the Chinese, or worse yet, investments that governors like Whitmer in Michigan have made in Chinese companies in the interest of bringing them to her state. You mentioned this battery plant as an example. It doesn't take much in terms of employment or in terms of investment money sloshing around in the district, or for that matter, I suspect some actual contributions as well to these politicians for them to be, in fact, with the team.
If you're a congressman from either party in a district, in a relatively poor district of northern Michigan, and the Chinese put a multi-million-dollar plant in your district, do you think you're ever going to make a statement against China ever again in your life? Do you think you're ever going to try and correct the trade imbalances? Do they get you. And Bill Lee's doing this in Tennessee, bringing big Chinese investment into Tennessee, a so-called conservative Republican.
Yeah.
Butch Otter did this in Idaho. Bringing the Chinese into your district is like bringing the mafia into your district.
Mm-hmm.
There's no difference. Only the mafia just wanted to rip you off. The Chinese want to rip you off and control you and kill your kids.
Let me ask you, Grant, if I can, one of the things that has been an idée fixe of the U.S. military for a generation or two maybe now has been the idea that if only we're talking with the Chinese, we will be able to, if not befriend them exactly, at least ensure that there are not conflicts over misunderstandings or the like. Could you talk a little bit, having been in both the diplomatic side of this equation as well as the military, the use that has been made by the Chinese Communist Party of the so-called military-to-military contacts, not only for the purposes of intelligence collection, which I think have been massive, but also for the purposes of perhaps capturing elite military personnel, as Xi suggested as well.
Well, they've done it very well. The Chinese have capitalized on American conceit, which is pretty much that if we can just talk to somebody, we can work out any problems and we can become friends. And the Chinese understand that. And all they really have to do, they've discovered, is just not say anything. And the Americans get really uncomfortable and start offering presents. But it is something that has hurt us, because there is a sense, as I said, that, well, we don't really have to be ready to fight. It's not that big a threat, and all we have to do is talk. And we become the supplicants. And the Chinese will occasionally say, okay, we'll talk to you. And then they'll stop and we'll get uncomfortable. But they have really played this well. And so many senior officers in particular seem to have had this belief that since they met some Chinese counterpart, they had a special relationship. And they knew that, well, these guys really aren't bad people. We just got to do more engaging with them. And it tends to cause you to relax your guard and to not really have the defense that you ought to have. One very good example of this is from like 2009, when the then commander of U.S. PACOM, today's Indo-PACOM, he was asked while he was in China if he minded on a visit, if he minded if the Chinese had aircraft carriers. And he said, no, I don't. And he said, I would be glad to help them as much as I can. And that shows you just how much America had sort of let its guard down. And at the time when it should have been getting ready and also keeping this advantage that it had over China and over the Chinese military, it has now lost much of that advantage, unfortunately. But the idea that we've got to engage, that's still pretty strong. And it's during the Trump administration, there was a halt on it pretty much, and now it's back in full swing. And there's, say, senior officers who think that we've got to talk to the Chinese, and thinking that you have to talk to a country, to people that want to kill you and that are killing last year 70,000 Americans with fentanyl, to think that you just got to talk to them. It shows that you've pretty much gone nuts.
Grant, on that point, I thought your comment about taking divisions worth of Americans off the battlefield through the weaponization of fentanyl was very telling. Could you speak quickly to the counterpart, also addictive, that is, I think, taking young people off the intellectual battlefield, if you will, namely TikTok? There's an effort underway, as you may have heard as we speak, by TikTok to insist that the U.S. government has to share with it classified information that has been developed as to what a threat TikTok actually is, between its addictive algorithms and its influence on, by some estimates, half of the American population who are now hooked up with it. But as a military man, again, how valuable would it be for you or for our country to have a similar kind of capability to be communicating with and influencing Chinese citizens, young people especially? And do we have such a capability?
Well, technically we do. As a practical matter, we don't. If we had the ability to pump our message into China, and so that most Chinese people saw it like 24 hours of every day, and particularly younger people who might be inclined to join the military, well, we'd like to do that. Well, that's what China's doing to us. And this ability to control or manipulate the way people think is particularly important when you're talking about young people who might join the military, but if they're hearing the Americans are bad, that do all these terrible things, well, why would they join the military? That's one effect that it has on us. But also consider the TikTok case. And TikTok is just one app. There's other ways that China influences. So while we're all focusing on TikTok, there's a bunch of other things the Chinese have got going. But what you saw when the TikTok CEO testified before Congress a few months ago, behind him was this phalanx of Americans. And this were the lawyers, the lobbyists, who are doing TikTok's bidding, doing the Communist Party's bidding. And it seems that there's a type of American who has a price, and it's usually not a very high one. And the Chinese use this very well. So they've gotten Americans to actually push their interests in America. And it is effective. Look at how hard it is to kill TikTok.
Trevor, last question to you. And I'm not sure I've got the name of the chap that you were referencing, whatever it is. He acknowledged, as you pointed out, interestingly, that one of the things that the Chinese have the ability to do are these sort of evil techniques to undermine the United States from within. Could you just, in closing, give us a word about whether what we're up against here, in no small measure, is, in fact, evil incarnate? We may be less perfect than some would like, including me, but on the other hand, I don't think there's any doubt that as between us, our system is good and theirs is genuinely evil. Your thoughts, sir?
That's right. Well, he made the point. He used the word evil. He didn't say nefarious. He didn't say clever. He said evil. And I think the obvious example was Black Lives Matter. Whether the COVID was accidentally or deliberately released, we can determine that all of the states in the Union, and this goes for countries all around the world that had the harshest lockdowns, and the most economic damage were all the states with the most Chinese influence. You know, where the unions, which are now controlled by China, kept businesses and schools locked down, and the subservient politicians went along with the plan. You know, Tim Walz had some of the harshest lockdowns in the country. You know, he followed the Chinese model, the Chinese mass line. And you saw the same thing in California, Hawaii, Oregon, etc. The same thing in Victoria in Australia, which has had a pro-Chinese communist premier down there, Daniel Andrew. And this was a pattern. So economic damage, fentanyl, the Chinese execute their own drug dealers, but they give tax subsidies to the people who produce the precursors for fentanyl. You know, they can stop it any time they want. Massive indoctrination of young kids. There are pro-Chinese groups in this country who write the curriculums for elementary school kids, or kindergartners in this country. One of them was run by Valerie Jarrett's mother out of Chicago. It's named the Erickson Institute for a famous Communist Party member, and Barack Obama gave them a prize in 2009 for their great work. You know, the Liberation Road communists who gave us Black Lives Matter, they state the open border is the way to the American Revolution. This is a deliberate communist program to bring millions of new voters, but also to bring the crime, the drugs, and the terrorists and revolutionaries as well. So all of those things, Black Lives Matter did massive damage, the COVID and the response, COVID did a lot of damage, the response did more. And look at the damage it did to our military with the forced vaccinations, drove a lot of good people out of the military. The Chinese-inspired political correctness, the wokeness, has done huge damage to the military. And even sport. You know, why is sport woke? Why is sport so anti-American? Because most sport sponsorship comes through Nike. And where does Nike do most of its business? Where does Nike produce most of its stuff? So all of these indirect, Hollywood, you know, remember the old Red Dawn movie of the 80s about the Soviet invasion of America? Well, they tried to make one a few years back about the Chinese invasion of America. And the Chinese exerted such pressure, they had to change it to North Korea and made a terrible movie. You can't make an anti-communist Chinese movie in Hollywood now. You couldn't do it. All of these things, these subtle things. I'm told there's even a Chinese billionaire who funds the transgender movement. Anything to just break down American culture, break down American family values, break down American government, influence the churches. This is a whole of government evil attack on this nation. You cannot say it in any other way.
Let me ask both of you, I said final question, but I do want to encourage those listening and those that will in the future as this video is posted and hopefully disseminated by all of you. Given what we've shared, given the state of the United Front Work Department's assault on our country as just one element of a much more comprehensive, unrestricted warfare, people's war now, they actually call it, against our country, just each of you take a couple of minutes, if you could, very quickly though, to tell us what we should be doing in response to all of this. Trevor, should we start with you?
I would just say the immediate thing is you look at politics and you look at your local congressional candidates, you look at your Senate candidates, who is taking a stand against China? Who is willing to compromise with China? Find the candidates at any level who have a consistent record against China willing to stand up. That is the immediate thing we should all be doing right now.
Let me just say in that connection, Trevor, that lest there be any confusion on the point, I'm not sure whether he actually represents the district in which this battery plant is being built, but John Molinar is now the chairman of the select committee in the House of Representatives that is essentially evaluating the Chinese Communist Party's threat to our country and helping warn about many of the things that we've just been talking about. And I know he is illustrative of the kind of people who's holding the line rather than capitulating to it. So I just wanted to be clear on that point. Colonel Newsom, what are your thoughts about what the American people, having heard about this particularly dire situation, should be thinking and doing at this juncture?
I think that Trevor's right, is that this has to, I think, start from the bottom up. And at the local levels, there's a lot that can be done by interested citizens who make an effort to not just educate themselves, but then educate others, but also work with local representatives. And you do see at state levels where there has been some good work done on restraining and going after, say, Chinese land purchases and other Chinese influence efforts. And they have a lot of success, whereas on Capitol Hill, it's harder. There's a lot of good people on Capitol Hill, both in office and also staff members. But at the local level, state level, where you can do a lot of good things and have an effect on all of this. But it's going to take people to get out and do something. For a long time, I think we've all had an idea that, well, somebody's looking after it all. But no, this is where individuals can make a big difference. And I've seen this in action. Speaking of the battery plant in Michigan, Joseph Sella and others have done some good work in exposing this and keeping it as an issue. And that is where I would say an awful lot of focus has to be on this.
Indeed, as I think probably most of those listening know, at least listening live, these are available to you all via subscription that's for free, but that facilitates ensuring that you're getting them. You can simply go to presentdangerchina.org to take them aboard at any time as well. Let me close by just adding another thought as to what can be done. And I think it must be said that despite all that we've heard about the Chinese success over the years in penetrating and subverting us from within by capturing our elites, the Chinese Communist Party is in very dire straits at the moment. It has, as we've talked about on many of these programs, serious economic problems. It has had a series of major industries go bust. Xi Jinping has mounted, I think, either deliberately or incompetently, a wrecking operation on what has heretofore been the sort of very successful model of Deng Xiaoping, the hide and bide strategy, whereby this false perception was created. We've talked about it today, of the Chinese just want to be like us, to be rich, and if they become rich, they will be friends and maybe competitors in the economic sense, but otherwise responsible members of the international community, as it's been called. The reality is he has done violence to that at the expense of the people of China, and they're very restive. There are, in addition to political manifestations of that restiveness, something that is a yawning and truly catastrophic problem, which is the cumulative effect of the population control, birth control mechanisms of the Chinese Communist Party, famously called the one-child policy. They now have, by some estimates, woefully inadequate numbers of young people to take care of the old, too few women for the men in the society, and I think simply a ticking time bomb in terms of the ability to support the Chinese Communist Party's enterprise. We can exacerbate that dramatically, going back to what I talked about with Colonel Newsom, by ending the practice of having our money, and when I say ours, I mean the 100+ million of us who have money in Chinese markets, by saying we're not going to do that anymore, by going to our financial managers, whether it's the pension funds, the 401k plans, the mutual funds, what have you, and saying, I want my money out of China. And it turns out, ladies and gentlemen, that there's a bit of good news here. I believe there's something on the order of 10 major emerging market funds now that have an ex-China, as it's called, option. And if you find yourself, if you talk to your broker about this, in China, with the click of a mouse, you can get ex-China. This can materially impact everything that the Chinese Communist Party is doing, and I believe as part of a concerted political warfare campaign, help defend our country, help defend our people against what the Chinese communists have in mind for us by helping the Chinese people liberate themselves from the regime that has brutalized them horrifically for decades. As we talk about in the indictment, by some estimates, their crimes against the Chinese people have killed 100 million of them, and that does not count the 400 million more that the Chinese communists boast of having murdered in the womb as part of that one child, two child, whatever it is now, policy. So they have their reasons to want to be rid of them, and we have our reasons to want to help the people of China do that. So let me just simply say once again, thank you to the team that has presented today, Sam Faddis, Xi Van Fleet, Trevor Loudon, Peter Schweitzer, and of course, Colonel Grant Newsom. These are among the very best we have on our team, and it is a matter of the greatest pride for me to be able to consider every single one of them both friends as well as valued colleagues, and to showcase their insights, their command of the facts, and their ability to help the rest of us do the same on these programs. So thank you for joining us for them, and please help us get this one and all the others around to your circles of influence as well. With that, I'll turn it back to Dee Dee with my thanks to her and my prayerful hope that the Lord will bless our country and our efforts to stave off the evil that is upon us at the moment from the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you, Frank. A video of this webinar will be posted to presentdangerchina.org within a day or so of the conclusion of our program. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. And join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how the CCP captured elites betray America. We'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us today, and goodbye.